Namaskar and welcome to this special year-end episode of Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host, Vikas Swarup. Today is the last day of the year, and as 2021 draws to a close, it is time for reflection on the year gone by and peering over the horizon to see what lies ahead for India and the world. To help us in this review of the past and guide to the future, I am joined by two outstanding experts. Coming to us via video link from Hyderabad is Ambassador SYED Akbaruddin. He retired from the Indian Foreign Service in April 2020 as India's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. Before that, he served as the official spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs from 2012 to 2015. He is currently Dean of the Kautilya School of Public Policy in Hyderabad and has just published his first book, India versus UK. With me in the studio is Ms. INDRANI BAGCHI, the senior diplomatic editor at the Times of India, where she reports and analyzes foreign policy issues for the newspaper. She is also the author of a popular blog called Globe Spotting, which she describes as a wide canvas through which she looks at the world and how India responds to it. Let me begin with you, Akbar. The COVID-19 pandemic is easily the single largest event in contemporary history in terms of the sheer number of countries and people it has impacted. No sector has been untouched by it, and certainly not diplomacy. Given the severity of the outbreak and the global restrictions on mobility it imposed, the normal rhythm of in-person diplomacy was completely disrupted. The UN and most multilateral organizations shifted their work completely online. Even bilateral diplomacy was impacted, with summit-level interactions also held increasingly in the virtual format. Prime Minister Modi himself held several virtual bilateral summits throughout the year, with Sweden and Finland in March, with the Netherlands in April, and the UK in May, besides participating virtually in a number of multilateral summits like the G20, BRICS, SCO, etc. As we speak, the COVID-19 pandemic is still raging, and new variants like Omicron are still being discovered, which means international travel will continue to be restricted. So are we witnessing the end of traditional diplomacy as we used to know it?
Well, first of all, Vikas, thank you very much for providing me an opportunity to engage with you in your new avatar and enabling me to express my views to your large and growing audience on Sansad TV. As you very eloquently put it, COVID has had an impact on every aspect of our lives. We are actually in the era of the long COVID. And so diplomacy can't but be influenced. As we diplomats like to say, diplomacy has key ingredients of style and substance. The hybrid formats that you have mentioned have mushroomed to address problems that are impacting both these aspects of style and substance. Hybrid diplomacy, which is now being resorted to, is a business process continuity mechanism in the changed circumstances. And like all business process continuity mechanisms, hybrid formats are never a complete and full substitute for the real thing. The impact on summit diplomacy, for example, with its elements of personal chemistry, direct engagement, pageantry, emphasis on public signaling, all these are impacted. And there is also impact on the substance, where backroom diplomats like to negotiate in person. This is less significant compared to the style impacts. But if we sit back and look, on the other hand, the diplomatic toolbox seems to have broadened. Leaders are now willing to participate in short summits of limited duration using technologies that were not used in the past. So let me give you an example. No Indian Prime Minister had ever chaired the UN Security Council, even though India has been on the Council 7 times before this. And Indian diplomats had presided over numerous Council meetings in the past. Yet, in this August, earlier this year, Prime Minister Modi creatively used the opportunity that technology afforded to become the first Indian Prime Minister to preside over UN Security Council session. So the Zoom boom is not such a bad thing. It's not the real thing, but it's not the bad thing too.
Thank you, Akbar. It is reassuring to hear that traditional diplomacy, traditional impersonal diplomacy will survive COVID-19. Broadband lines ultimately are about physics, and in-person meetings are about chemistry, as you said. And in diplomacy, chemistry always trumps physics. So let's now shift to the traditional model of diplomacy. And the first principle of India's diplomacy has always been neighborhood first. So Indrani, can you take us through the major highlights of India's interactions with its South Asian neighbors in 2021, leaving aside Afghanistan and China for the moment?
Thank you, Vikas, for inviting me to this program, and it's my first, of course. As you said, the neighborhood occupies a huge portion of Indian diplomacy. And just this week, Foreign Secretary Harsh Shringla was in Myanmar. So maybe it's a good time to begin with Myanmar. I think Myanmar has presented a challenge in 21 because of the coup on the 1st of February, the jailing of Aung San Suu Kyi, the sentencing, the verdict against her, and the kind of a civil war-like situation that we see in Myanmar. We also see the West resorting to traditional sanctions and a kind of a familiar deja vu sort of situation of isolation versus engagement. And I think Harsh Shringla's visit was actually very important, that we cannot actually take the same road as the West. We cannot also take the same mercantilist, opportunistic road that the Chinese take in Myanmar, because we have geopolitical interests, but we have humanitarian, neighborhood, political interests, security, of course. And I think almost all of those issues were taken care of. Well, the engagement has restarted, and I think that's a good thing. From India's experience with Myanmar, public sanctions, public humiliation really doesn't work on that nation. So it's probably a much better idea to engage with them, push them towards quiet diplomacy, and that's where your traditional diplomacy comes in, because a lot of this cannot happen on the Zoom boom. Correct. It can happen only behind closed doors. Bangladesh was a celebration this year. 50 years after they fought and got their liberation with Indian help, Bangladesh is a thriving neighbor. The most important thing is that after a number of rocky, difficult years, we have come to a place with Bangladesh, which is actually very interesting, where India is actually its biggest development partner. I don't think we spend as much money on any other country in the world as we spend on Bangladesh. Security, connectivity. I mean, for everybody who has dealt with the Bangladesh file in the MEA for years, connectivity, transit used to be such bad words in Dhaka. But it's now, it's across the board. The trains are running, the inland waterways are running. We are sharing power, you're sharing gas. So it's becoming a symbiotic relationship. It's kind of becoming a relationship that Indian diplomats used to dream of. Nepal, of course, went through a very tough 2 years, but Nepal it's a rolling situation. You go through bad periods, and then you go through another bad period. But I think there's some sense now that Indian infrastructure projects, etc., are working. Their politics are their politics, and India is always a part of their politics. So I think we cannot avoid. But with the new Prime Minister and with their new government, things have been quiet. In a sense, that's actually a lot that we can hope for, because too much of turbulence in Nepal impacts very key states in India. So I think 21 was less turbulent than 20 where Nepal was concerned. So yes. I think that's not a bad thing. Staying in that part of the region is Bhutan, and Bhutan give its highest civilian award to Prime Minister Modi. I think that was, we've had very close relations with Bhutan forever. So that wasn't a surprise in that sense. But it seemed to me that it was an interesting political signaling on the part of Bhutan in a year when they've come under a lot of Chinese pressure to for a border,
settle the border,
to give up claims to Doklam. I imagine the Chinese have made it very attractive for them. So for them to actually then reach out to India at this point, I think is an interesting signal or political signal. Maldives has been a success story since 2018 when Ibu Sole became president of Maldives. And I think India has really invested quite deeply in Maldives, etc., with the Greater Malay Connectivity Project, with a lot of infrastructure projects, with a lot of other projects where, and they have been a lot more sensitive to our security concerns.
In fact, they have articulated an India-first approach.
Yes, of course, now you do see an India out campaign that has started by former President Abdul Yamin. And so I think those will be a slightly choppy waters which India will have to negotiate in the next year. Pakistan has remained a challenge. Has been, there's been no connectivity, no connection between India and Pakistan officially for several years now. Pakistan by itself would say that they've had a great year because in effect Pakistan has won the Afghan war against America. And for whoever says anything else, this has been the second superpower that Pakistan has seen off in Afghanistan, because with the Taliban coming back into power in Afghanistan, it has been a Pakistani victory. The point is, what does the victor do with the spoils?
Exactly.
And I think that is a challenge that Pakistan is only beginning to realize now.
Especially given the tailspin their economy is in.
Indeed. And in fact, this week, as you must have noticed, Pakistan has agreed to go back to the IMF, to get into the IMF program, because they've actually run out of places that they can go to for money. Sri Lanka did their own self-goal, if you ask me, because the Rajapaksas, they did this whole thing about making it an organic agriculture system, which of course makes it impossible to do agriculture, as anybody who looked at Sikkim would have told them. But of course not. And they are having their own little wrinkles with the Chinese. But on the slightly more positive front, for India at least, when the Sri Lankans cut India out of the Eastern Container Terminal deal, and we've just got the Western Container Terminal deal, I think that may in the long run, that may probably be a better deal. However, it has taken India almost a year, and I wrote a story on this, to get the Chinese off 3 islands that they were trying to sort of plant themselves in north of Jaffna, which is really, really close. That's a relationship you just have to nurture very, very carefully and very, very closely. Hold on to them.
Thank you so much for this very, very comprehensive overview of India's neighborhood policy. Akbar, the most momentous development in our neighborhood took place in Afghanistan, with the Taliban seizing power on August 15 in a lightning advance following the troop withdrawal by the United States. How do you see the situation unfolding there? And what should be India's strategy of dealing with the Taliban going forward?
Developments in Afghanistan are perhaps the most significant changes in our region during 2021. The swift seizure of state power by an entity which was proscribed globally and has in its ranks many individuals who are designated as terrorists is a new phenomenon. Obviously, from our perspective, it's an adverse development. Now, our experience of Taliban 1.0 has not been a happy one. All of us recollect the events related to the hijacking of IC-814 are symbolic of that period and the difficulties that we had. Yet we have tried to make the best of our perch on the UN Security Council by shepherding global concerns about Taliban 2.0 and have worked out a format and a template that now globally is recognized that Afghanistan should not be used for terrorism directed towards other countries. In addition to issues relating to inclusivity, human rights of women, and rights of safe passage. But that was 4 months ago when UN Security Council Resolution 2593 was adopted. And those 4 months have brought to the fore the specter of a human catastrophe a humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan, because seizure of power is one thing, governance is another thing totally. But what are our choices? Our difficulties are with the Taliban, not the Afghan people. So what do we do in these difficult circumstances? I suppose there is no choice but to revise the global framework that was prepared for a different situation and to adjust to the current needs. So you've seen recently, there was a humanitarian exemption approved through the Security Council, I think Resolution 2615. Globally, we have to move in concert with others rather than be lone rangers in this effort. We have some key strengths that can be part of a global humanitarian effort to assist the Afghan people. But I would think that Afghanistan is too important for India not to have a presence on the ground for long. What we need to do is that the circumstances now demand not a black and white approach, but to tread in gray zones. And that's what we need to creatively look at.
Indrani, the COVID-19 virus emerged in Wuhan, and yet China emerged from the COVID-19 crisis stronger and more assertive. This also had a big impact on India-China relations, with External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar saying on record that never in the last 30 years have India-China relations been in a more difficult phase. Do you see any prospects for an early improvement in bilateral ties with China?
Unfortunately not, Vikas. Because I think the trouble is not just the problems at the LAC, where Indian troops and Chinese troops are still in a face-off situation. And despite 2 agreements on disengagement, we see Chinese troops in a rebuild position which should not have happened, but they have, which means that the reason why the Chinese came in there in the first place continues to remain valid for them. And the EAM, Dr. Jaishankar, has even said that, we have not been able to get a credible reason from the Chinese about why they are doing what they are doing. That said, we have to live with that reality of an aggressive expansionist China. And how do you deal with such a China is actually going to be the biggest challenge. From 2020, India and China, like the US and China, India to a much more limited extent because India's abilities are much lower. This a kind of a decoupling that you've been seeing, which is getting at least Chinese investments out of India's tech sector, finance sector. Everybody looked at the banning of the Chinese apps, but that is actually less important than the growing Chinese presence in India's tech sector. So you're also seeing Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, in all its periphery. So I really do not see things improving in any meaningful way until the Chinese themselves come to the conclusion that this is a lose-lose proposition.
Relations between China and the US also deteriorated sharply under former US President Donald Trump, and the Biden administration has continued to maintain pressure on China. Yet, at the same time, China was able to conclude an EU-China comprehensive agreement on investment and is continuing with its Belt and Road Initiative. How do you see the future evolution of ties between China and the West in general and the US in particular?
So, as you correctly said, I mean, to some degree, Trump, for all his chaotic governance, actually sort of pointed finger to the problem, to the core of the problem, and sharply turned the US-China relationship into a more competitive or a more adversarial relationship, and that has continued because the China challenge, so to speak, is accepted across the board, across the political spectrum in the US. The point is, how does this work? I mean, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, spoke about some parts of competitive, some parts collaborative, some parts. I'm not sure that's going to be so easily compartmentalized, but certainly competition is now the dominant sort of theme in US-China relations and likely to remain. The focus of that is technology, is future technologies, current technologies, less defense, much more on these new areas, innovation, etc. Europe is interesting because while they are a Western entity, they can't actually help themselves with the Chinese. And you see that the difficulties that Germany is having vis-a-vis China in terms of how much do they want to be nice to the Chinese, because in a way the German system, the German economy is a mirror image of the Chinese economy. So I think that we can see that difference, the difficulties there, and how much to engage without angering America, and how much to not, how much to push back so that they can preserve some of their own space. We see, little bits and pieces of stuff coming out, like Sweden and China have had a terrible year, largely because Sweden accuses China of stealing their technology. So. So the Europeans are struggling, and you can see they're struggling on two fronts, three, because there's Russia, and they have that challenge because they don't know exactly how much to engage, how little to engage. China is that challenge. So and America is a challenge. I think the race will be won or sort of decided on the field, in the field of innovation and technology.
Akbar, speaking of the West, as you pointed out, a major development in 2021 was the holding of the India-European Union summit virtually on the 8th of May in Porto, with all 27 EU leaders, along with the presidents of the EU Council and Commission. This format was used only once before with US President Biden. The summit adopted the EU-India Connectivity Partnership and launched negotiations on three major agreements: trade, investment, and geographical indications. How important was the summit, and can India and the EU actually clinch a trade deal?
Usually we used to have summits at the Troika level. This time it was expanded. It's a signal, an important signal that the ties are now much more broad-based than they were in the past. Also, the agreements actually fit into the Indian objective of trying to integrate with the global value chains, and Europe is a key partner in that effort. We are already trying multiple efforts of trade agreements, not only with the EU, but with the UK, with Australia, with Canada, perhaps with the UAE, also with the US. Since we decided to sit out of the Rsep, we need to look out for other partners in this. Now, the EU is India's third largest trade partner, accounting for, I would think, about 11% of India trade. And so it would be, after the US and China, the third largest trade partner. Let us remember that the trade agenda is an old, unfinished agenda. The free trade talks actually with the EU had started in 2007 and were actually left suspended in 2013 because there were sharp differences. But From an EU perspective, I think the biggest challenge will come on environment, because the EU is now integrating climate change controls, carbon pricing into all its agreements. And that's going to be a big challenge.
Indrani, during the year, apart from the EU, Germany, France, and the UK came out with their own guidelines for engagement with the Indo-Pacific. How do you see the increasing strategic convergence between India and these countries?
Indo-Pacific has actually become literally the geopolitical center point of international politics right now. We've been at it since 2018, I'd say. It has taken a couple of years. My sense is that it's the flowering of the Quad that has drawn others to focus on the Indo-Pacific. Conversely, it is also China's, the potential challenge that China poses by its aggression, by this fact that it's trying to take over parts of seas, oceans. It's the intrusiveness of Chinese expansion. I think that there's a way to push back. Also, a way to sort of not be left out, what is called FOMO.
Fear of missing out.
Yes. So not be left out of this new geopolitical sort of reality. And I think that's one of the ways, certainly, that India's relations with these countries have deepened. I mean, the UK's integrated review focused a lot on the Indo-Pacific. The French, which was the first, France, which was the first country to actually, European country to come out with an Indo-Pacific policy. And because, you see, France is an Indo-Pacific power. And, after thankfully winning the Caledonian referendum, they continue to be a resident Indo-Pacific power. There is obviously a little bit of a troubled point right now after AUKUS. But I think the fact that France is such a close partner of India, both in the Indo-Pacific and, of course, in other fields, I see the France-India relationship deepening quite significantly, and I would not be surprised if there is another new trilateral on the horizon between France, say, UAE and India. So I think everybody is looking at both opportunities as well as challenges and how to be part of, it's also part of this whole new sort of little plurilateral arrangements, or the new multilateralism, if you will, which Akbar knows everything about. But yes, I think this will be a focal point for a lot of strategic partnerships in the region.
Indrani, the first visit that Prime Minister Modi made outside the subcontinent in 21 months was to the United States in October, where he had his first in-person interaction with President Biden and Vice President Harris. How do you assess the trajectory of India-US ties under the new US administration?
So some part continuity, because and welcome continuity, because of course, if you remember, there were many people who said that because Prime Minister Modi had this sort of bromance with President Trump, whether it would work in a Biden administration. And I think the thing is, India is a bipartisan,
issue in the United States.
And gets a bipartisan approval, stamp of approval. The point is, how do we work on that bipartisan point of approval? Because US politics, like Indian politics, is shape-shifting all the time. And you do have, there are new forces in US politics which India will have to deal with. The progressives within the Democrat system, for one. The far right, which is another force that is growing. So you do have to be a lot more agile and have to keep your attention very, very close to the details of US politics. So that's something that.
But the trajectory you see is going up and up.
Yes, you can see. I mean, the Quad is again, the Quad is, look at the areas the Quad is looking at: supply chains, vaccines, technology, 5G technology. Every one of these are 21st century issues.
Akbar, another Quad was born this year, the West Asia one, with India, Israel, the UAE and the US as its member, something that was unthinkable just a few years ago. How do you see the changing equations in the Middle East post the US brokered Abraham Accords, and how does India stand to benefit from the new geopolitical realignments?
I would think that West Asia is perhaps the area in which India's ties have blossomed perhaps the most in the last few years. If you look at our engagement with West Asia, it's been structured along, say, three key pillars. The Gulf states, which host more than, say, 7 million Indians, where we source a significant amount of our oil imports from. Israel, which plays a key role as a supplier of security equipment, an important partner with whom we work on key technologies, on development issues, agriculture especially, etc. And then Iran, with whom we have civilizational linkages and strategic coherence on matters relating to connectivity with Afghanistan and Central Asia. Now, if you look at each of these elements, you will see that ties with the UAE and Saudi Arabia are no longer only limited to the economic domain, or the labor domain, which was the usual practice for, I think, decades. We've now moved to strategic domains. The balancing act that we performed in our initial engagements with Israel and the Arabs has helped mature our ties with a spectrum of Arab states. And the Abraham Accords now have led to cross-pollination of the type that we hadn't ever imagined. So what we are now looking at perhaps is to work beyond bilateralism with those partners where we have a degree of confidence, and that perhaps are the basis for the genesis of what's called the West Asia Quad. It's Quad not only because it has 4 members, that is the US, Israel, UAE and India, but like its predecessor, the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, it's treading into non-traditional areas of cooperation.
Looking eastwards now, Indrani, Prime Minister Modi participated in the 18th India-ASEAN Summit in November under the chairmanship of Brunei. Given the centrality of ASEAN in India's Act East policy, what are the emerging contours of India's economic and strategic engagement with the ASEAN region, especially post-India opting out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Rsep agreement? And is there any prospect of India joining Rsep in the near future?
Well, to answer your last question, I don't think so. Because the problem, I think ultimately what it boiled down to was that that Rsep was like a backdoor entry for China to get a free trade agreement with India. I think ASEAN has been very disappointed. Particularly our closest friend Singapore has been extremely disappointed, and I have to say that I think because of the focus on Indo-Pacific and on the Quad, maybe we have not engaged ASEAN as deeply as we could have. I think individually, perhaps, I see the India-Indonesia relationship growing quite robustly. I see the India-Vietnam relationship growing quite interestingly. I'm not so sure about the others. And I think both sides have to find that new thing to focus engagement. We have this new concept called global supply chains and shortening supply chains, trusted supply chains. So where are the ASEAN is again caught in the middle of this, because they're so closely aligned to the Chinese, and yet they want the Western markets, etc. A lot of this will will come undone, but there will be some degree of unraveling.
Indrani, Japan, South Korea and Australia are the other three major partners of India in the region. How did India's ties with these countries evolve in 2021?
Well, suddenly Australia has become our best friend, which is so interesting. For anybody who goes back to the nuclear test days and the really harsh reaction from the Australians to our nuclear test in 1998, the pushback against India's nuclear deal, the difficulties that we faced when we were trying to do a deal on a civil nuclear agreement, etc. So, and today you couldn't recognize that old relationship.
Completely transformed relationship.
It's a totally transformed relationship. We're collaborating across the board. Japan, of course, everybody in India, I think, misses Shinzo Abe, to be honest. Certainly in the government, I think everybody misses Shinzo Abe because Shinzo Abe was this sort of force in Japanese politics and in so many different ways. And so I think there are a lot of work, I think, will have to go back to engaging with the new government in Tokyo. South Korea is a very interesting country because we've got excellent relations with South Korea. And I noticed during the last 2 years, there were a couple of these things which I call Quad Plus, which is Quad Plus, South Korea, New Zealand, Vietnam was one group I saw for supply chains, etc. I saw another one, another Quad Plus of Quad Plus South Korea, Israel and Brazil on vaccines. So you can see that South Korea is playing a bigger and bigger role in India's calculus. Not just India. I think the Americans tried hard to get South Korea to be part of the Quad. I think there's a little bit of an issue there. But be that as it may, South Korea has a very close relationship with China. So the fact that South Korea is engaging in this way with the Quad is also equally interesting.
Akbar, multilateralism has been under stress lately, and the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated a deeper crisis of international cooperation as nations closed borders and resorted to vaccine nationalism. How do you see the WHO's response to COVID-19 and the future of multilateralism in general?
Well, COVID-19 has exposed fissures that have been in existence for long, but were not visible. If I can say that, no one has come out looking good from this experience, neither states nor interstate institutions. However, states have shown that they are at the cutting edge of responses. International institutions, unfortunately, haven't displayed that. The problem that I see that has come to the fore is that there are no institutions today that are able to function as platforms to address global issues. Now, I'll try and explain that. Let's take the WHO. It was neither successful in warning about the outbreak of the coronavirus in 2020, nor was it able to throw light on the origin of the virus when they sent teams to China. Finally, it also fell short in the goal of assisting in the equitable distribution of vaccines across the globe. The COVAX initiative that they were part of has little to show for its success. Not even 10% of Africans have got 2 doses. This is when the developed world today has hoarded enough vaccines, not only to give booster doses to their entire populations, but there is also talk of a 4th dose in some countries. Yeah. The current mechanisms for handling these big global issues are either inadequate or old or unavailable. There aren't any big platforms to address these huge global issues. And that's why these alphabet soup mechanisms have spread out. Different coalitions are trying to address different non-traditional issues. These are serious concerns such as global public health, migration, digital technologies, cyberspace, outer space. There is nothing to address any of these holistically. So that's the challenge that international organizations face.
Akbar, apart from COVID-19, There was another C that dominated the headlines in 2021, and that was climate. How do you evaluate the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, and should India be satisfied with the outcome?
Well, for climate, yes, there is a forum, the UNFCCC, and the COP, or the Conference of Parties, that meets regularly. It didn't prove to be a breakthrough that many had hoped for. One can say it was less successful than what was hoped for, but it was more successful than its predecessor, the COP25 in Madrid. Cumulative commitments, even if achieved in full measure, will not be adequate. Pledges were made, promises were made, tangible progress may be thin. Now, from an Indian perspective, it showed India to be an active and key player. Prime Minister Modi's presence at the summit, the substantive commitment made, and they're really substantive in some areas. For example, 500 gigawatts of renewable energy goals by 2030. It's an increase of 50 gigawatts from what was only announced a couple of years ago in 2019 at the UN. Reduction of carbon emissions by about 1 billion tons by 2030. Raising the share of renewables in installed electricity capacity to 50% by 2030. These are all important goals. And of course, there is the goal of commitment to carbon neutrality.
Indrani, due to the pandemic, there were incoming visits by only 2 foreign leaders in 2021. One of them was the Prime Minister of Denmark, and the other was the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Despite Russia's reservations on the Quad and the Indo-Pacific and its deepening ties with China, are India-Russia ties back on track?
I'd say that India-Russia ties never really got
off track.
I think both of them have 2 other primary relationships. Russia's relationship with China is much deeper, much broader than they admit, than we care to admit. Our relationship with the US is pretty broad and deep as well. However, I think India is not ready to give up on Russia, and I'd say Russia is not yet ready to give up on India either. I think for both countries, it makes sense to hold on to the other. As India diversifies its weapons or defense buys with other countries, I think India is also investing more in the energy sector in Russia. And that is important. But I think for both countries, it's a familiar relationship. Both sides know each other really, really well, as at the state level, and they're willing to live with the fact that both sides have other partners.
And what about Russia's ties with the West? Do you see any prospects of normalization anytime soon?
I mean, if you just see what's happening on the Ukraine front, it's actually very hard. So, it puts India in a bit of a spot as well. I mean, India was, I think, very careful not to mention the Ukraine issue during President Putin's visit. One of the things that India would like is to see a more normalized relationship between the West and the US and Russia. I'm not sure that's happening in the way that India would want, but I think as far as India is concerned, that would actually be an optimum outcome.
Akbar, India continues to be a member of the United Nations Security Council and chaired it in August this year, as you mentioned. But does the Security Council matter any longer? And how do you evaluate India's role in the UNSC so far?
There are a host of other crises which, if left unaddressed, can have global consequences. Imploding states, leading to refugee flows, mass migration. So look at some of these happening now. Look at Afghanistan and humanitarian support. Who takes on those responsibilities? Or look at Syria in the past. Again, the humanitarian impact. Ethiopia, Yemen, Libya. Now, all these are either orphan conflicts, nobody is interested, and then they will have consequential impact, or there has to be a body to address them. And that's the role of the UN Security Council. as far as India is concerned, this is our 8th time that we are on the council. We have a year to go. What is different now compared to the past was that there is a greater intensity of the engagement by our political leadership across a broad spectrum of matters related to international peace and security being addressed in the Security Council. Next December, we will be president of the council, and perhaps we can showcase our value on the diplomatic high table.
Now I want both of you to gaze into your crystal balls and give me your final thoughts in 1 minute on the shape of the world in 2022. Indrani, you want to go first?
Wow. So Afghanistan will be our challenge, a challenge, and I think Akbar was absolutely spot on when he said we need to think creatively about our presence in Afghanistan. China will be in the front and center challenge because we need to make sense of Chinese aggression, but we also need to be able to push back quite convincingly to show the Chinese that we are serious. And I think that's something that we will have to continue to plug away at. The Quad, we need to grow the Quad. The US relationship will continue in more or less the same way. Our neighborhood will remain part opportunity, part challenge. But I think that part opportunity is what we should build on. But I think, in a sense, we will go through this cycle of good days and bad days in the neighborhood. That's sort of par for the course, given the kind of neighborhood that we live in. So where is your opportunity? And I think Akbar put it well about in West Asia. I think this is an area of the world I think that we are building on, and that's very important. I'm looking at also the new focus on Central Asia. So who knows what that might bring? Yes. Can't bring a Quad certainly, but let's see.
Yeah. And Akbar, what are your thoughts?
Well, because the honest answer is I don't know. But I'm not the only one who doesn't know. Neither does anyone else. Let's start with discarding. Let's start with not discarding some wild cards. The first is the pandemic. We don't know about its capacity to generate scary new coronavirus variants. The second is the global inflation and the impact that this has globally on the recovery that was in an incipient stage. The third is what Indrani mentioned is China. Now, China's economic and political interventionism could trigger global consequences. But global situations usually follow trajectories which are visible. So, as Mahatma Gandhi used to say, the future depends on what we do in the present. So what was visible to us in 2021? What was visible was a global recovery which is underway. We hope that it will gather pace in 2022. So economically, the hope is that we see a much faster recovery than we saw in 2021. An end to the pandemic, a return to normal economic and market conditions. Even if the pandemic doesn't end fully, we learn to live with this new normal. But this new normal will perhaps have divides between developed and developing countries, which were sharper than before. Perhaps there is a drift away from global integration towards decoupling. Some call it one world, two systems. And of course, we are in an era of great power competition, and there are accompanying uncertainties. But, we need to end on an optimistic note. So if I were to say what is there in 2022, I would say nothing could be worse than what we went through in 2020 and 2021. So whether 2022 is annus mirabilis, I don't know. But it's also the 75th year of our independence. Let us hope it is better than 2021 and 22. And we are able to observe Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav in a better situation than what we witnessed in the last 2 years.
My last question is to you, Indrani. The Queen of England once referred to 1992 as an annus horribilis, a Latin phrase meaning horrible year. How would you describe 2021?
Phew. The year of the jab. I think the whole world has been educated and has been immersed in fighting a pandemic with a vaccine or with no vaccine. And I think as the year ends, we are looking at new variants, new vaccines, and new jabs. So everybody present your arm and get that jab.
And on that optimistic note, we will wrap up this special year-end episode of Diplomatic Dispatch. Thank you to my two brilliant panelists. 2021 was indeed a year of challenges, but also of hope and renewal. So let me end with the hope that this new year will bring all of you good health, happiness, and humanity's triumph over the virus. Till we meet again in 2022, goodbye.